Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb.
And I'm Becky Scherr.
Today we are here with another two-guest episode to break down the recent lawsuit here in Minnesota about President Trump's eligibility, or lack thereof, to be on the ballot in 2024. We are starting the show by talking with Dave Thul, who is one of the signers of the lawsuit, claiming that President Trump is disqualified from being on the presidential ballot. We will then be joined by James Dickey, a Minnesota attorney with the Upper Midwest Law Center, who will help us break down the legal side of the argument regarding ballot eligibility. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the show. We are excited to be joined here by Dave Thul. Dave is a activist, conservative activist, used to be much more actively involved in the Republican Party of Minnesota and supporting Republican candidates. I know Dave from that role. I used to be the deputy chair of the party and was active in a number of campaigns, as was Becky. And Dave was actively involved in the party process. But Dave took a very principled, a strong position upon the arrival of Donald Trump to the Republican Party. And we're having him on today to talk about his evolution as a conservative, but not supporting Donald Trump, and also talk about his role in a lawsuit that was recently filed that would have an impact on potentially Donald Trump's name being on the ballot in Minnesota. Becky and I had the opportunity to interview Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon for an episode last week. The lawsuit came up in our interview, and we could think of no better resource to talk about that lawsuit than Dave Thul, someone who I consider to be a friend, but also someone who is a principled conservative, who is someone who sticks by his word. I want to start by welcoming Dave to the podcast and asking him to talk for a few moments about his evolution as a conservative in this state, his previous involvement as an identified Republican and being active in the party, and what occurred over the last few years that led him to be a part of this lawsuit that could have a huge impact on whether Donald Trump's name appears on the ballot in Minnesota. Take it away, Dave.
Thanks for having me on, Michael. So I got active in Republican Party politics in Minnesota in 2008. I was just back from deployment to Iraq. And prior to that, I'd always voted. I always paid attention to politics, but never active in a party. I got active after Iraq because I saw the kind of the disconnect between what the media was telling us about Iraq and what I was seeing firsthand. So in spring of 2008, I helped put together a Tea Party for the local Republican Party. And a couple months later, I was asked to take on a leadership role as co-chair. And I served in that position on and off for most of 8 years, from 2008 to 2016. I also served briefly as chair of the 1st District Republican Party and as a delegate to the executive committee. So I served at all levels. I ran for office at one point and was very active, very dedicated to the Minnesota Republican Party. That changed in 2016 as it became clear that Trump was going to be the nominee. I was very frank with the local Republican Party and said if that were to happen, I would have to step down. And the reasoning was, I guess, twofold. First, part of the role of an officer in the party is to advocate for those candidates, right? To ask people to go out and vote for the Republican Party candidates, and that was just something that I couldn't do. I also hoped that it was possible that resigning in protest might get some attention, might make some other people question things. And there was a group of us that tried to do that at the state convention, ultimately unsuccessful. And so I haven't called myself a Republican since after the election in 2016.
Now, that's, I mean, a relatively brave thing to do, right? I mean, here you are, these are your friends you've been working with for almost a decade. And it does become a very friendly, jovial, these are people that you spend time with, you have meetings once a month, you all believe the same thing. Was it hard to step away, and did you get much backlash for that in the first place?
It was hard to step away. I was amazed by the number of media requests that I got, and I was uncomfortable with the attention, honestly. But like I said, in the service of the idea of getting a resignation out there, it was something that I had to do. But it was very uncomfortable. I had people that I'd been friends with for the 8 years that I've been involved with, who suddenly shunned me and wanted to have nothing to do with me. And I understand that that's their choice, but it was disappointing.
Dave, I want to, as always, thank you for your service to our country and your military service. I want to say to our listeners that politics has a very bad reputation in a lot of circumstances, and politics does a lot to let people get that impression. Dave is one of the good guys. He is someone who has always stood for his convictions when it was popular and when it was unpopular to do. I don't think Dave is someone that sticks his finger in the wind to see which way the winds are blowing to decide which side he should take. He's always been a principled conservative. And when Becky and I were talking about this show, Dave's name has been mentioned very frequently as being a guest, as someone that we wanted to bring in because, in part, I think it's fair to say, Becky can obviously speak for herself, but I think it's fair to say that neither Becky or I are huge fans of Donald Trump. I did not vote for him in 16 or 20. And one of the things we wanted to break down on this podcast, and the lawsuit gave us an opportunity to do it in a much more, I think, with some borders on the conversation, is to highlight a voice like Dave Thul's, who is someone who left the party because of the arrival of Donald Trump. And the stands that he has taken over his life has shown that this is a man of conviction, someone who believes in doing the right thing, even when it's unpopular. And I'm very proud of Dave's work in the past, his role that he took in speaking up about Donald Trump. We in this podcast want to give everybody an opportunity to speak, and we'll likely have people on this podcast who are incredibly passionate about Donald Trump. But I wanted just to disclose at the beginning, or midway through this interview, I should say, that where Becky and I align in particular with Dave, because I think it's important for our listeners to know that where we've stood and what position we've taken on Donald Trump. Becky.
Yeah. So one thing I'm curious about, Dave. So I also did not vote for Trump in 2016. In 2020, I'd spent 3 years in Congress. I'd seen some of the stuff that had gotten done, and so I decided I'm going to vote for him. 2020, I came around. I voted for him. Now, obviously, things changed shortly after, and I absolutely lived to regret that decision after January 6th, and was disappointed. Did your view of him change at all in those 4 years, in that first term? Did you have glimpses of like, maybe I can get on this guy's side, or were you steadfast against him the remainder? No wrong answer. I'm just curious.
Sure. So there were times when I supported what Donald Trump was doing in office. I am a believer in border wall, whether it's a physical wall or it's what technology that we use. I firmly believe that there has to be some sort of barrier, and I supported what he was trying to do on that. I supported him when he said that the embassy in Israel was going to move to Jerusalem. So there were things that he did that I passionately agreed with, but the majority of what he did in office, I wouldn't have supported. I never seriously considered voting for him, and I want to point out I didn't vote for the Democrats either Hillary or Joe Biden, because I don't politically align with them either.
Now, I'm sorry. During that time, were you helping, pushing, working for any candidates either before 2016 or 2020, or just standing for the policies that you believe in the Republican Party, maybe?
Yeah, I wasn't politically active between 2016 and 2020. Honestly, I don't think there was any area in the Republican Party that they would have wanted my support. I probably would have been a negative for a candidate. I, there weren't any good candidates, honestly, that I
Hmm.
felt I could support. Right, like I said, I don't align with the Democrats, and the Republicans wouldn't have me. Now, I voted mostly Republican since then. I'm still a conservative. My beliefs have not changed, but it's just that the Donald Trump specifically and some members of the Republican Party, they don't align with my principles anymore.
Dave, one of the Republican Party, and having worked for the party in a number of capacities, and also having served in leadership, the party is relevant in a number of different ways. What I find interesting and also disappointing about the shift in the Republican Party is that there used to be more of an opportunity, and I'd be curious if either of you agree or disagree with me, but there used to be more of an opportunity to if you didn't necessarily agree with all the candidates, to have a space that you could work in. And what I've noticed since 16, and it has developed and it's metastasized and become even more serious, is that this is not just the Republican Party, it's the Republican Party of Donald Trump. And that space to work inside the party as a conservative is just, it's consumed by everything all Trump. One of the concerns that Becky and I have raised about the upcoming election cycle is that if Donald Trump is the nominee, he will consume all of the media attention. There will be no opportunity, I think, for Republicans to succeed, particularly in the state of Minnesota, with Donald Trump on the ballot, because he's such a corrosive and all-consuming element. And I don't know if either of you disagree with my position on that, but at various times in the party, we've had leaders and there's been opportunity for disagreement. But it does seem to me that since the arrival of Trump, it's become the Republican Party of Trump, and there's not enough space and respect for people who have principled concerns like Dave Thul to exist in the party.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I want to point out, I don't think badly of someone if they voted for Trump in 16 or 20, right? They were, most people looked at the presidential election of I choose this person or I choose that person. It's a simple choice. But obviously January 6th changed all of that, right? It's a completely different conversation now. So the people that are still supporting Trump, that confounds me. I just don't understand it at all. But you're right. This has become the party of Trump, to the point where in 2020, you recall, Minnesota had their first presidential primary, except we didn't on the Republican side because there was only one name that was allowed to be on the ballot, and that was Donald Trump.
I'm not asking if you're supporting another candidate for president right now, but if Donald Trump was not the nominee by some circumstance, would you feel more comfortable coming back to the party?
Potentially, again, I don't know if I'd be welcome, but I would certainly try. There are several candidates that are running for the Republican nomination that, if I had the opportunity, that I would support. I plan to vote in the Republican presidential primary coming up next year. I don't know if it'll do much good, but I certainly plan to. And yeah, if Trump were not on the ballot, I think that would change the dynamics quite a bit.
Let's pivot to the lawsuit that you put your name on. Describe what the lawsuit does, how you became involved in that process, and what you're hoping to accomplish by filing that suit with the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Sure. So the lawsuit, at its core, is fairly simple. It says that on January 6th, Donald Trump organized an insurrection and gave aid and comfort to the same. And by the plain text reading of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, he is disqualified from holding office again. At its core, that is as simple as it gets. Now, it's certainly not that simple. The legal petition that was submitted is 84 pages long. It lays out in granular detail the reasons that we believe that what Donald Trump did on January 6th qualifies for the word insurrection. Our intent, our hope, is that the Minnesota Supreme Court would agree with that and would have a finding that Donald Trump is not eligible to be on the ballot because he's not eligible to hold office again.
Now, there's a number of different signers to this lawsuit. Can you speak a little bit about how the group came to be? I think it's a good variety of folks from different backgrounds, and if you want to tell us a little bit about how you got on this with a former Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, that was interesting. I was contacted by someone I used to work with in the party, and described a potential effort coming together and asked if I would be interested, and I certainly was. This is the type of issue that if I had any legal training myself, I would have probably tried to take it on myself. I'm certainly glad I don't have to, because I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, and it's incredibly complex what the legal team is doing. I don't know any of the other petitioners personally. I've never worked with them. Um, I'm honestly kind of surprised that the amount of media attention that I'm getting when you consider that there's a former state Supreme Court justice and a former Secretary of State. Those are the two names that most everybody and that's politically active or politically connected would know. But again, our effort is focused solely in Minnesota, and it's focused solely on January 6th. We just talked about my my opposition to Trump. That's not part of what this is about. This is specifically about January 6th, the insurrection, what his actions that he took in the run up to it, and his inactions on the date of January 6th. You can spin a lot of different theories about what was going on. It was Antifa, it was the FBI, whatever you want to say. But the fact that for 3 hours, Donald Trump did nothing, took no action to stop the mob at the Capitol, that to me meets the standard of comfort.
As Michael mentioned, we did talk to Secretary of State Steve Simon last week. During that interview, we chatted a little bit about how there was a similar suit that had been filed in Colorado, and Trump's team had made the request for that to move that from state to federal court. Obviously, every state's different. How this plays out, again, I know you're not an attorney, but is there any insight that you've gotten from your conversations of the path forward, or any timing that you may be able to share?
No, other than we expected it would move quickly. As the Secretary Simon talked about, there is a known legal process in Minnesota for what we're trying to do. We've had candidates been disqualified from the ballot before, so I think obviously this is much higher profile. This is a presidential rather than a state legislator. But the process is there, so hopefully it will go fairly quickly. The intent is to get this question decided as quickly as possible, so that the Republican Party then can make, do whatever they need to do then going into an election year if Donald Trump is not eligible, he's found to be not eligible to be on the ballot.
The other distinguished Minnesotans who signed on to this lawsuit are former DFL Secretary of State Joan Grow and former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Paul Anderson. Dave, I'm not surprised that you got as much media attention as you have for a couple of reasons. Number one, no disrespect to former Secretary of State Joan Grow, but it's honestly not that surprising that a former DFL Secretary of State would weigh in on this. Justice Anderson, retired Justice Anderson, a little bit more surprising. But what's so compelling and interesting about speaking with you is the fight you've taken long before January 6th. You were one of the, there is a number of people who can say that they were bamboozled or hoodwinked by Donald Trump's speeches and his positions and were eventually won over by him. But you've taken a principled position since 2016, and you raised the alarm bell very early about what the potentials of electing someone and endorsing and supporting someone like this for president could do. So that's why I know that I wanted to speak with you, because your evolution to where we are today and your backstory is so rich and compelling, and it needs to be explained and it needs to be discussed, and our listeners need to hear that, because you're just not a partisan who's putting their name on a lawsuit and trying to get the president removed. You've taken a series of principled positions that led you to today, or led you to this interview and led you to being involved in this lawsuit. So it's not surprising to me that you're getting in all these calls from media, because it's very unique what you've done. And whether people agree or disagree with your name being on this lawsuit, one thing they can say about Dave Thul is that he doesn't stand by his principles.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say. This isn't something that I wanted to do. I was reluctant to do this, but I think it's the right thing to do, and I think it has to be done. The feeling that I think most other Americans had the day of January 6th, watching the footage of the mob assault the police officers, going into the Capitol building, going into where the Congress was in session just minutes before. That leaves a mark. That that memory will never go away of that feeling of disgust and hopelessness. And honestly, I think the only other event in modern history that most Americans would connect that to is 9/11, where we saw live on TV what was happening and the absolute devastation. And to people that would say, well, what Trump did was not insurrection, I challenge you again to watch some of the footage, to watch the American flag being torn down and the Trump flag being put up in its place, to watch the number of Trump supporters that were there that day and the comments that he made in the days up leading up to it. And again, his inaction on that day. And I challenge anyone to tell me how that doesn't meet the criteria for insurrection.
There is a political reality, though, that would happen if Trump's name was removed from the ballot in Minnesota. And I guess I'd ask this question to both you and Becky. You both have experience in working in campaigns in Minnesota. What does an election cycle look like in Minnesota if Donald Trump's name is not on the ballot, but his name appears in other places? And before you answer, I do think that Secretary Simon offered some insight as to the trajectory of where this case goes. And it's ultimately to the United States Supreme Court, who will make potentially a final decision as to whether Trump's name will be on all or any ballots across the country. What does an election cycle look like without Donald Trump's name on the ballot in Minnesota, where there's no presidential candidate that Republicans can vote for? They would have to write his name in. How does that help or hurt the Republican effort statewide? And also on the flip side, does it help the Democrats or hurt the Democrats to not make a boogeyman out of Donald Trump?
I'll start here. I think you can look at it very differently for two ways. I think if Donald Trump's name is removed from the ballot, um, because of this lawsuit and others, the Supreme Court deems that. Not saying that I'm not supportive of this, but I think in that situation, enough Republican voters would stay home that it would impact the other Republican tickets negatively. I think if Donald Trump was not on the ballot because he dropped out of the race or somebody else won a nomination or for whatever that reason, I think that those people navigating properly, as we talked about, having to work in that MAGA lane a little bit, I think they could still have potential. So while I'm not saying this is nothing against my personal views of a lawsuit and removing Donald Trump from the ballot, but I do think that because of this environment that it's the Republican Party of Donald Trump, as you mentioned earlier and we discussed, I think that those pure Donald Trump voters that we saw him get out that hadn't come out in a while for us, I believe there would be a significant number that stay home that would impact those down ballots.
So
Dave,
that's
you.
interesting. I guess I'm putting on my political hat for a minute. I would expect somewhat the opposite reaction. I would think for the person who is a passionate Donald Trump supporter and who's not on the ballot, I would think there would be an intense effort then to support somebody else and kind of get their reputation that way. I, I, we, you can what if it, I think quite a bit, but regardless, to me, um, I'm not focused on the political questions that come out of this. I'm focused on doing what's right. And I think, so I had this conversation with my wife. I think the question whether or not do you move forward with an effort to um, the lawsuit that we're doing, um, there are negative consequences if you do it. There are negative consequences if you don't do it. Very much like when the conversations we were having with should a former president be indicted in federal court? Negative if you do it, negative if you don't do it. But I think the default position should be trying to follow the law and follow the Constitution as closely as possible. So yeah, the political ramifications, I don't know. We could speculate and yeah, I'd probably be more successful in your fantasy football league than that type of speculation.
Let me just be clear. You would be more successful than Becky. but you could try to be more than me, but you certainly would be more successful than Becky.
But I think that's an important distinction of going into this lawsuit. You're not looking at you have to look at this at at the case in hand, and I think that's appropriate. And again, I hope mine didn't come across against what you're doing at all. I just think that from my perspective, because you're right. I think there are people that are going to come out and vote because Trump would not be on the ticket. I tend to believe some of those people swing back right on the down ballot tickets or candidates, but I mean, who knows?
Dave, the clause in the 14th Amendment that you're referring to, that's the basis of this lawsuit. Help me understand and maybe explain to our listeners. Donald Trump has not been convicted of insurrection in any way. And one of the pushbacks on this is that you're holding him guilty or you're holding him accountable for something that he has not been found guilty of. Explain to our listeners your position on that answer or that question.
The 14th Amendment was passed a few years after the Civil War. It was intended to prevent those who had participated in the Confederacy from holding office in Congress or any office in the federal government. I understand the question of he hasn't been convicted yet, but if you think about it, nobody after the Civil War was convicted of serving in the Confederacy, right? There was not a necessary a requirement for that to happen. Everybody knew, and it was a simple matter that way. I guess there's all sorts of potential decisions that the state Supreme Court could come up with, or the U.S. Supreme Court if it goes that far. One of them may be that they feel that a conviction is necessary. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but again, I think any reasonable person looking at what happened on January 6th should be able to come to the conclusion that that was an attempted insurrection.
I would agree with you. It was a terrible day. And I think that the actions of Donald Trump on that day, again, I'm not a lawyer, haven't played one on TV. We do have one person on this podcast right now who did attend 1 year of law school and can provide some legal analysis. And she's the podcast chief legal analyst, aside from being the voice of reason on this podcast. But I can't explain the legal ramifications or what's going to be decided in court here. What I can say to you is that there's a number of things that Donald Trump has done that should disqualify him from being a candidate for president of the United States. And I think that you have pursued, true to your convictions, a legal scenario by which he could be disqualified from running for office. I have frequently said that Donald Trump is like a relative that just stays too long, and Republicans need to tell him to hit the road on so many issues. And yes, I hear from people about the positive things that Donald Trump did, Supreme Court justices and other stuff. But the reality is that I think he will hinder Republicans' chances of retaking the Senate. He will help Democrats retake control of the U.S. House of Representatives, and particularly in Minnesota, it will be very difficult for there to be oxygen for Republicans to make any legislative gains with Donald Trump on the ballot. Now, Dave, true to your convictions and true to your principles and the way that you lead, that's not really a factor right now in why you filed this lawsuit or you were a part of this lawsuit. But that's a consideration and analysis that we like to break down on this show. One other question I have for you is this, and this has come up. I've heard a number of people that are not supportive of Donald Trump bring up this lawsuit, not your particular lawsuit, but the lawsuits that are fanning out across the country related to this. And their argument is basically this. Look, one of the problems with Donald Trump supporters is that they feel the system is out to get them, that they feel disenfranchised. They feel that the election was stolen. And if you file a lawsuit like this and disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot, you're only adding more fuel to this belief amongst many of his supporters that he's the target of some conspiracy, he's the target of the deep state, and that the tentacles of government are trying to block him from running for office. What's your take on how this could impact, if he is removed from the ballot, what that could do to all of his supporters who expected him to be on the ballot?
I think it's important to note that neither I or anyone else involved with the lawsuit are trying to disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot. He disqualified himself on January 6th.
That's a
We're
good point.
simply trying to follow the Constitution. Again, um, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? We talked about the legal issues. Trump's been indicted on multiple felonies. It's entirely possible that Trump is not able to be on the ballot because he's in jail, or I don't know if that would prevent him from being on the ballot. But if he's in prison, it can be kind of tough to be president at the same time. I understand, but I think the idea that Trump is getting railroaded or it's the deep state or something like that, I think that's more of a political calculation by Trump and his campaign staff, so that no matter what happens, Trump gets the outcome that he wants. In Trump world, he can't lose, right? He didn't lose the 2020 election, right? That's their belief, even though that there's no evidence to support that. So if someone has a belief that's not rational, I don't know that there's much you can do to convince them otherwise.
What I find so interesting in this interview is, Dave, you have a tremendous political acumen and background. What I've come to realize from talking to you in this interview is how little politics and the ramifications of what could happen to Donald Trump if he's not on the ballot played into that and into your decision to be a part of this lawsuit. It's really remarkable. I think a lot of people would have thought that someone with your political background this is pure politics, that this is all about an agenda that you have, and it really seems to be, and I'm not surprised by that. But I think it's interesting in this interview how little thought you've given to the political ramifications of this, and really entertaining that. To you, this is a very principled position about what should be done. It's a matter of right and wrong. It shouldn't surprise me. I don't think it should surprise Becky based on your reputation and experience in the party. But I'm just glad that our listeners were able to, as we answered questions throughout their interview, get an idea as to what the character is of Dave Thul. And this is someone who's put themselves out there. I'm sure you're getting some criticism for doing this. I'm sure you're taking some heat. Dave has got some broad shoulders. He can carry that heat. But I can think of no one better that we could have had on to talk about this from the side of being an advocate of this suit than you, Dave, because of the positions that you've taken over the years, because I know you're just a good conservative at heart, but someone who believes in right and wrong. And that's why I believe even more, that's what led you to get involved in this suit.
Yeah, exactly. Again, this is not something in a perfect world that I would want to do, right? I'm not someone who craves attention. I'm an introvert. I'd rather sit in the background. But this is something I have to do, much like I volunteered to go to Iraq because I thought it was the right thing to do. So I feel very much the same here. I swore an oath every time I enlisted and re-enlisted to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And in my mind, I didn't stop being held by that oath because I'm retired from the National Guard. That lives with me until the day I die.
Dave, in closing, before we go here, what's the next step in the legal process for you? You filed the case with the Minnesota Supreme Court. Do you have any idea on the timing, whether the court is going to hear your case, and what any potential timing is on any lawsuit that you've filed here?
So that gets into the legal area, which I'm not an expert at, but my understanding is that we're hoping to have something from the court, whether the state Supreme Court looks at it directly or they appoint somebody to look at it. No idea yet if there would be testimony required to be given, or if this is simply a matter that the court discusses and makes a ruling. I honestly I don't know. So I guess when the court lets us know, that's when I'll know something.
Well, I really appreciate you coming to join us this week. I think that this is super interesting. I appreciate, again, as Michael has said, I think that this is, a true testament to who you are and what you believe. I hope, that whether it's because Trump does not win, he's not allowed on the ballot, whatever the case may be, I hope you come back to the Republican Party after the era of Trump. I know that Michael and I are, me more than him, dip our toes back in. And, I certainly have faith that the Republican Party will come back around, and our candidates, I know our policies and what the Republican Party as a whole believe in are strong and deserve good people like yourself in it. So hopefully we can all move on at some point, and really appreciate you giving us some insight to all your efforts here. And as things progress, hopefully we can chat more with you.
I appreciate you guys having me on and being able to have a little bit more in-depth conversation. Some of the media stuff is really quick hits, so it's good. It's good to talk about it. It's good to, I think, understand the rationale and the why, and like I said, hopefully we will be hearing something from the state Supreme Court.
We will post links in this episode, depending on how we promote it. We'll promote links to the lawsuit and links where people can find out more information and where people can follow. Dave, just in closing, I want to say to you, I really appreciate you coming on for all the reasons that Becky described. And if there's ever, we would certainly welcome the opportunity for you to come back on to give updates on this lawsuit, but also just to opine. You are a voice that is someone that we need to elevate. And I think Becky and I identify a lot with the road that you've taken. And this is our podcast, and we get to make the rules, and we get to elevate voices that we want to elevate. And so I hope that you would consider sometime down the road, as we get into the presidential election cycle, even though that your role, you've identified who you are and where you are in this race, to offer some analysis and commentary or other things on the presidential cycle. I think you have an insightful perspective that needs to be elevated, and I hope you'd consider coming back, aside from just talking about the lawsuit, but also on talking about the Republican Party, where they need to go coming into the election cycle. I think there's a lot of things that you could offer, and so I hope you put some thought in maybe considering some of those invitations, sir.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
We are excited to be joined now with James Dickey. James is an attorney here in Minnesota and with the Upper Midwest Law Center. And James, we wanted to bring you in to kind of chat through the legal argument side of things when it comes to this lawsuit about Trump's eligibility or lack thereof on the Minnesota ballot, but also nationwide. So James, why don't you start out? Can you explain to us a little bit about the Upper Midwest Law Center and how you got involved and your background?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Becky and Michael. Really appreciate the time. Upper Midwest Law Center is a nonprofit 501c3 public interest law firm here based in Golden Valley, Minnesota. We bring lawsuits against government overreach and abuse on a pretty consistent basis. Some of the lawsuits that you may have heard about us related to are the lawsuit against the defunding of the Minneapolis police, where the Minnesota Supreme Court held that Mayor Fry must hire at least 731 officers, or at least make every effort to do so. That's one of them. And so we constantly are trying to take cases on behalf of citizens of Minnesota, often where they don't have the ability to hire their own lawyers, pay a private lawyer to take up those important cases. I started working at the Upper Midwest Law Center full time in July of 2020. I'm the senior counsel there. I've been there, like I said, since then, so about 3 years and change. Before that, I've been working as outside counsel for them since their inception, though, and I'm really happy to be able to do the work that I do. It's a fun job for sure, and I get to be involved in a lot of really interesting discussions like this one. So thanks again for having me on.
And now, just for a point of clarification for our listeners, you're not involved in this current lawsuit that's moving forward, are you?
No, I just have opinions about the legal issues. Really, that's pretty much it.
Perfect. So we already talked to Dave Thul, one of the signers for the lawsuit. So from your reading and understanding of this, can you speak a little bit to the legal argument that these plaintiffs have brought forward, this lawsuit that claims that Donald Trump is ineligible, is disqualified from appearing on the 2024 ballot?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, I want to begin by saying that the individual petitioners are highly respectable people. I have great respect for former Secretary of State Groh, former Supreme Court Justice Anderson, and Dave Thul and others who are very intelligent people, and they are certainly entitled to their opinions and viewpoints. And my role here is not to talk about really my own personal viewpoints, but really just the law. And as far as having researched this issue, looked at the 14th Amendment, Section 3 to the U.S. Constitution, I really don't see any way to keep former President Trump off of the 2024 ballot if he is nominated or runs as an independent or whatever he does. The amendment itself states that no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, and I'll skip forward, under the United States if they've taken an oath and then have then engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States or given aid or comfort to the enemies of the United States. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove essentially the action of that entire subsection of the Constitution. So first of all, I don't believe that under the cases that exist from around the same time when the 14th Amendment was enacted, and based on historical context for what is a rebellion or insurrection, that there's any really strong argument that President Trump engaged in rebellion or insurrection against the United States. And I also, I don't think even the petitioners in this case are making any argument that he's given aid or comfort to the enemies of the United States. But in terms of this, the concept of engaged in rebellion or insurrection, there's some major flaws with the argument that the petitioners in this case have made. So first of all, I think that when you're looking at what is a rebellion or insurrection, you have to look at historical context. You've got, obviously, the Civil War is a great example of a rebellion or insurrection. President Lincoln literally brought forth the entire national army because they had to in order to put the South back in its place and preserve the Union at all costs. But if you look at, for example, around the time of the founding, when our country was a fledgling republic and didn't have significant infrastructure, far less than did even in the Civil War. If you look at the Whiskey Rebellion as an example from 1794, in that case, that was where American whiskey producers objected to a tax. It was like a 9 cents per barrel of whiskey or something, the kind of tax that we look at it with like, oh, what's that today? But that rebellion resulted in substantial violence across the western portion of the country at the time, which was western Pennsylvania and similar locations. And at one point, as part of that rebellion, an angry mob marched to drums to the house of a wealthy landowner and tax collector who was being protected by American soldiers. They fought with American soldiers for hours, set fire to buildings, and the soldiers then surrendered. And President Washington then eventually called forth the militia to put down the rebellion. He assembled more than 12,000 men from surrounding states in eastern Pennsylvania as federal militia to stop the rebellion. There's also a law review article that I think is very interesting. I think they conclude incorrectly, but they have an interesting perspective from professors Michael Stokes Paulson of St. Thomas Law School and William Baud, and they argue that Trump is ineligible to serve and should not be on the ballot. But some of the examples they give, I think, actually show a distinction that they probably didn't intend. And so some examples that they give in that case were President Grant in 1871 invoked the Insurrection Act. So we're talking about what the meaning of an insurrection is, to secure order in South Carolina, defeating the KKK. In Louisiana in 1872, there were, after a contested gubernatorial election, white supremacists attempted to overthrow the elected Reconstruction Republican government, which culminated in the infamous Colfax massacre of April 13, 1873. And in that situation, a white mob attacked and massacred perhaps 150 Black citizens who had been defending a courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana, and the Reconstruction Republican government. And President Grant invoked the Insurrection Act as an authority to suppress the insurrection that sought to overturn the election result. And there are other examples like that I don't need to get into every single historical detail, but there are, I think, documented cases throughout history of what are really insurrections or rebellions against this country. And the actions of those who assembled before the Capitol, rioted, stormed the Capitol, while shameful in and of themselves, never really presented a serious threat to overthrow any government absent some kind of intervention. And so, clearly they were intended to disrupt the certification of the election, of Joe Biden's victory in the election, but they were never to the level of a rebellion or insurrection that would actually cause this provision to be triggered if it's still a live provision. So that's issue number one that I see with their arguments. Number two is that the provision itself is not self-executing according to contemporary case law. And I'm specifically referring in this instance to the time where the case called Griffin's case, where then Chief Justice of the United States, Samuel Chase, was sitting by designation in the Circuit Court in the District of Virginia. This is in 1869, right after the passage of the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And Chief Justice Chase held in Griffin's case that, in fact, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment had to be activated by an act of Congress after the passage of the 14th Amendment and applied in particular to any individual. That it's not a self-executing standalone provision that just exists out there and can be can be used at any moment absent an action of Congress. So if Congress were to act today, then the argument would change, of course. But Congress hasn't done anything to say, President Trump, you're off the next ballot. Surely they impeached him, but he was acquitted. That's the only evidence related to Trump in terms of insurrection or rebellion is his acquittal. So it's not very good evidence that the Congress has done anything to cause that to happen. Another problem from the legal perspective is the express removal of the quote unquote disability of 14th Amendment, Section 3 in the Amnesty Act of 1898. And that Amnesty Act of 1898 was passed by more than a 2/3 majority of both houses. And it said, we are removing the disability related to the 14th Amendment. It was very open-ended blanket statement. So I think that there's a good argument that the 14th Amendment, Section 3 is a dead letter entirely. And there's one other argument that just general point is that the 14th Amendment doesn't specifically mention president as an office from which you can be disqualified from appearing on the ballot or from being eligible to hold office. It mentions a lot of different offices. So I'll go back and take a look at the text here, and it says, no person shall be a senator or representative or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state. It doesn't mention president. And in other statutes under the United States Code, and Professor Josh Blackman and Seth Tillman have made this argument, so it's not my original argument or anything, but in other provisions of the United States Code and in the Constitution itself, like in the Appointments Clause, the president is specifically named. And so the president is not generally held to be a quote unquote officer of the United States just in the abstract. So there's an argument to be made that when it comes to the president's office, this particular provision would not be applicable to the president. To summarize, I think there's a good reason why, and the Supreme Court has weighed in on, the individual elector. Every one of us is an elector, and weighed in on the right of people to choose who they want to be their nominee, to be their president. And in a case called Reynolds versus Sims, the Supreme Court said this: the right to vote freely for the candidate of one's choice is of the essence of a democratic society, and any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government. So there's a really deeply undemocratic aspect to this case, in that it attempts to stop people who, they want to put this guy on the ballot, they want to, put him in the White House. It stops them from having the opportunity to do that. And I think that it's always going to be very carefully scrutinized by any court, whether the Minnesota Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, as to whether or not you can keep someone like President Trump off the ballot.
James,
go ahead,
go ahead,
Michael.
Becky. No, go ahead.
That was a lot of great information, and I love the historical aspects of a lot of this, because I think that is really what legal arguments are, is the precedents and what comes from that. So essentially, absent any action by Congress or any legal conviction of maybe even convicting Trump of insurrection, you find this far-fetched that he would be removed from the ballot?
I don't think it'll happen. And again, I have great respect for the plaintiffs, the petitioners in this case. And I also have great respect for the justices of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And I really I know they're very serious minded people, are fair jurists, and I just don't see them taking this, I think, an extreme step to keep someone like President Trump off the ballot in this particular case. So again, I think that it's an interesting legal argument, right? Legal issue. I'm always interested in cases like this that pop up. But I don't think that at the end of the day, the Minnesota Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court is going to do anything and hold that President Trump should not be on the ballot in Minnesota.
James, the Minnesota Supreme Court has scheduled a hearing on this matter in November. Will the Trump campaign be required to come in and argue they should be on the ballot? Who argues the opposing side to this?
Well, I would be shocked if they didn't. I don't know if the Trump campaign is going to do anything. I would expect that they would, because the respondents, I believe the Minnesota Republican Party is going to put in a response on September 27th. And there was a quote I saw from Chairman David Hand saying, that they're planning on doing something or other. The other respondent is Secretary of State Simon, who has said, he's not taking any position on whether Trump should be on the ballot. He's just the respondent in this case because under the particular statute, Minnesota Statute 204B.44, he's responsible for, creating statewide ballots. And so therefore he's a respondent in the case. But I mean, I would be shocked if the Trump campaign did not intervene. And that's what I think you'd call it, as intervention. And the Supreme Court, as you said, I think they said hearing for November 2nd. If that's the case, there's plenty of time between now and then for, if the Trump campaign intervenes, for them to grant the intervention and then take their, make their arguments as to why President Trump should be allowed on the Minnesota ballot for the upcoming primary and then the general election.
Independent of what happens in Minnesota, one of the scenarios that Secretary Simon opined about, again, recognizing and respecting his role in this, is that this ultimately gets to the United States Supreme Court, and they will decide a universal standard. Do you agree with that, what Secretary Simon had said, which is that this will end up at the U.S. Supreme Court, they will determine if Trump's names appear on any or all ballots across the state?
I think it's almost certain that that's going to happen. I think he's probably right, because we're talking about the definition and meaning of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court is always the last word on federal issues like the 14th Amendment. And so I think that as just a matter of course, if let's say the Minnesota Supreme Court disagrees with me and adopts the arguments of the petitioners and says Donald J. Trump cannot be on the Minnesota ballot for the 2024 election, I guarantee that there would be an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court from the Minnesota Supreme Court, which is one possibility. If you lose in the state's highest court and you have a federal issue that you've raised in your argument, then you are entitled to an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And while the U.S. Supreme Court takes very few cases, about 1% to 4% of cases, depending on the year, from those that are appealed, this is certainly the type of case that they would jump in, and they probably would even issue emergency rulings to make sure that there's no prejudice to anyone, including the state processes for putting people on the ballot. So I think it would move very swiftly, depending on when the Minnesota Supreme Court makes a decision to go to the U.S. Supreme Court.
James, I'm not a lawyer. I haven't played it on TV, but I do have a question about timing and process. One thing I do know is that the legal system moves very slowly. We're coming into 2024. We're going to be voting here relatively soon in some states. Right after sometime in January, some of the states are going to start voting for president. Can you lay out and explain to our listeners a little bit of the timetable from? Obviously, we have a hearing coming up November 2nd in Minnesota, but
Right.
give a timetable on when Minnesota decides and kind of the process of this getting to the U.S. Supreme Court potentially before we get a final answer, that's not going to be a quick process, is it?
Well, usually you'd be 100% correct. I
Like to
always
hear
tell
that.
our, yeah, I always tell our clients just the wheels of justice turn slowly and then much more slowly than you really think. And that's true for about 95% of cases, that most cases are very slow moving. You file a complaint, the other side answers, and there's motion practice, and the court will take months to decide whether whether the government wins or the defendant wins, and if on a motion to dismiss, for example. And then if you win those, if you're the plaintiff, then you go back and through the whole system again. You go through discovery and summary judgment. It takes years sometimes to get to the end of a lawsuit. However, Minnesota Statute 204B.44 is a very unique procedure designed specifically related to elections. And on election issues, the Minnesota Supreme Court works extremely fast. And emergency relief is always available for like if the Supreme Court held, like I said, that if they disagreed with me and said, this actually does have merit and he can't be on the ballot, the U.S. Supreme Court sometimes issues emergency stays and other things like that within just days or even hours. So in this particular instance, what the Minnesota Supreme Court has done, so this case was filed September 12th, and they're setting a hearing date for less than 2 months from that on November 2nd. That gives them an opportunity to have read all the pleadings and everything, and basically probably already mostly hashed out what they have, what they think is the right result, pending the arguments of counsel, which they always do, of course, consider. Let me give you a quick analogy to another case that I was involved in. I already mentioned the Minneapolis police case that we brought to the Minnesota Supreme Court eventually. We lost in the court. We won in the district court. We lost in the Court of Appeals, reversed in the Court of Appeals. And then we asked the court to take expedited consideration because we had a 1-year deadline from the date of the district court decision for the mayor and city council to comply with what was then the writ of mandamus that was issued. So all that legalese aside, what happened was we appealed on March 17th of 22, and then we also moved the court to expedite the review. They did so, and they set up a hearing. They granted review. They expedited review. They set up a hearing date for June 9th of 2022. The briefs were all due on, I think it was May 3rd, May 17th, and May 24th. And so it was all this, crunched up time. And then we argued the hearing on June 9th in the Minnesota Supreme Court. And then the court made an initial order and decision on June 20th, 11 days later. And in that case, they held that the mayor has a duty to hire up at least 731 cops in Minneapolis. And that was, again, 11 days from the date of the hearing. So in this particular case, going back to the case by analogy, I would be very surprised if it took them more than a week or two to issue an order, at least an initial order, saying whether the case has merit or not. And then they usually what they do is follow up with a decision, maybe a month or two later, a full decision, if they intend to issue one. So I expect in this case, while the wheels of justice often turn slowly, like I say, I do think that the court will work very quickly, relatively speaking, in this case, and have a decision before December, I would think. I've been wrong about that before. I had a case in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court related to a ballot question, which is also a 204B.44 case, and it took them several months to make that decision, even though the case had been granted an accelerated review. So there are contrary examples that I acknowledge, but I do think they're going to move really quickly in this one.
Once the Minnesota Supreme Court decides, how quickly, and is the next step then the U.S. Supreme Court?
It is,
How
yeah.
quick is that process? Explain that for just our listeners.
Yeah. So, what will happen? I mean, let's just pick a number a date out of the hat here, and just say the Minnesota Supreme Court issues a decision on December 1st, right? And then you got the primary coming up in, I don't remember when Minnesota's primary is off the top of my head. Is it March or something like that? Around Super Tuesday.
It's February, yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm not up to speed on that, but so they got 2 months or so. What'll happen immediately is that if, let's say, Trump is held to be ineligible for the Minnesota ballot, then the U.S. then the Trump campaign at that point will almost certainly, if not the Republican Party of Minnesota as well, immediately petition the U.S. Supreme Court for a writ of certiorari. And they'll also apply to the U.S. Supreme Court for an emergency stay. And I don't know all the details behind, like in the black box of how those emergency stay applications proceed, but they work quickly. And you've seen recent cases where there have been applications to the U.S. Supreme Court, which has then stayed a decision pending, a full hearing on the merits. But so that emergency stay application will come soon after if Trump is held ineligible. If he's not held ineligible for the ballot, if the Minnesota Supreme Court rejects this case, then the petitioners can appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're not going to be able to seek a stay because there's no action taken by a court that they could seek to set aside. But they could ask for an emergency decision because of the timing of the primary ballot coming up and then the general election ballot within a year, which I think the U.S. Supreme Court would take up either the Minnesota case or other states' cases, as I think Secretary Simon hinted at, or consolidate cases in order to make a decision on this theory and just writ large.
Which kind of brings me to my last question here. So in Colorado, where the other case has been filed currently to determine that Trump's eligibility on the ballot, in that case, the Trump's team has already requested a move from the state court to the federal court. I
Sure.
assume that something like of that would probably happen in Minnesota as well. And if that were to happen, is that change of venue something that would happen before or after that November 2nd hearing?
Well, they could seek that they can go from the Minnesota Supreme Court. They could seek removal, is what it's called, to the federal district court. But I don't know if they're going to do that or not. Obviously, they did in Colorado. And that's up to then the federal court to decide whether they should take it up. Frankly, I think that removal would be appropriate if it were sought by the Trump campaign, because it is a federal question we're talking about here. The question is not a Minnesota constitutional question or Minnesota state law question. The procedure is Minnesota state law, but the federal question is at issue. The 14th Amendment, Section 3, does it bar Trump from office? So that could happen. If it does happen, directly to your question, Becky, I think that it would happen before the hearing, and then there would not be a hearing in the Minnesota Supreme Court. And in that case, then you shift over to the federal court system. So you have District of Minnesota, followed by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court, 1, 2, 3. So, and I do think that given the nature of the case, they would still move way faster than they normally do and try to rush an outcome.
And would that expedite things, kind of bypassing the Minnesota Supreme Court because they don't have that step?
No, I don't think so, because when you appeal, so if it goes to the Minnesota Supreme Court, the way it typically works is that if the state's highest court has made a decision on the merits, then you can appeal directly to the U.S. Supreme Court from there. So if you go to the federal district court, I think you can skip the Court of Appeals in an emergency application from the federal district court. But, let's just say that given the makeup of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals compared to, Minnesota Supreme Court, it's more likely that the 8th Circuit would move to at least to against this particular petition than the Minnesota Supreme Court. So it is possible that the Trump campaign might say, well, we've got, 17 out of 18 judges in the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals that are appointed by Republican presidents. So maybe we should go into federal court and go that way. It's certainly possible they would do that, but I don't know if that would save them any time. It might be a safer move for them, but I don't know if it would save them any time.
James, we want to thank you for joining us today. It's always good to have lawyers on and people who help explain these issues to us. Where can people track what you do and the advocacy work that you do? Where can people find you at?
You can find us on our website at umlc.org. umlc.org. We're the Upper Midwest Law Center. Like I said, we do we're a nonprofit 501c3 law firm, and we try to take on cases that are important to Minnesotans against government overreach and other types of abuse.
James, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. We hope you'll consider coming back with updates on this story or others that come about, and know that you always have a safe place and a friendly place that you can come and talk about issues that are relevant to our listeners and to yourself, okay?
Hey, thank you all for having me. It's been great to be on, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Becky, we did a two-part A-side, B-side. This week, we interviewed Dave Thul and then James Dickey, both talking from different perspectives. Dave on the political side, James on the legal side, regarding the lawsuit that has been filed in Minnesota to disqualify President Trump from the ballot. Your take on both interviews and where you think this goes.
First, I will just take a line from Dave Thul and say, it's more about, he said, it's not about disqualifying Trump. His argument was that Trump disqualified himself, and this is about eligibility. So I'm trying to take in what I learned from some of our guests as in my vocabulary here. But I think it was really interesting hearing from both individuals. I think we chatted a little bit. I'm very impressed with Thul. He is a good messenger on behalf of the argument that they are trying to make. It is not political from their standpoint. It is purely about eligibility and the legal arguments. With our recent interview or last interview here with James Dickey, I, again, a election nerd, history nerd, was really impressed by hearing some of the factors that he was pointing to in our nation's history when it comes to these legal arguments that are being made. And in particular, one thing that really stood out to me was where he mentioned in the 14th Amendment the offices or individuals that are mentioned, and the lack of the presidency being mentioned there. The writers of our Constitution were very particular in their writings, and something being included or not being included was because of a reason. Now, it does not explicitly say this doesn't apply to the president, so there is that wiggle room there. But I do think that that is an argument that I hadn't heard before when it comes to this situation, and one that I think is an interesting thing to look at.
I'm not intelligent enough to opine on, as you are, the legal aspect of this. I can, though, comment on my perspective on Dave Thul's interview. I thought he was concise, precise. He did not waver from his perspective as to why he did this. I was also impressed by the number of times I went back to the political calculation, which is where my mind goes in all of these situations, is to think about it from the political perspective and what he meant, and how that didn't factor into Dave's reasoning. Dave is a consistent conservative. He is someone who I've agreed with and disagreed with. Dave and I have sparred sometimes in the arena of politics, and I was really happy to have him on because I do think that the interview that we had with him showcased his character of who he is. And he is someone who we talked about, and I say this a lot in the podcast, that we talk about guests that we wanted to have on. And Dave Thul is someone who I've wanted to have on because he's put a flag down on his convictions in terms of the party, took a very principled stance on the arrival of Donald Trump. And as someone who is not supportive of Donald Trump, and I know you to a degree are not supportive of him either, it's a safe space that we want to create for people to talk about why they left. And you and I have both had experiences with Dave Thul in the party process, and he is someone who I think needs to have his voice elevated. I think that he is just a good, principled conservative. And it's unfortunate that the arrival of Donald Trump has pushed people out. And Dave represents a number of people who are no longer a part of the party as much as they should be and could be because of the arrival of Donald Trump. And it frustrates me the number of people who have not felt comfortable inside the party since the arrival of Trump. And it was good to have him on. I do think that taking the one perspective I think I can articulate from the legal side is, as much as James was, I think, precise in that this could be a faster process, it is going to still take weeks, if not months, to resolve. We're getting very close, as Secretary Simon articulated in our current interview, our current episode that's out there, when voting is going to start. And this is going to create unnecessary drama and turmoil leading up. And not to take anything away from Dave and the legal proceedings, but this is what Donald Trump creates. Donald Trump has created this type of situation. And to the point, I do agree with Dave that he brought this on himself, that people are asking these questions because of what he did. And the problem with Donald Trump's candidacy is something that we've articulated before, Becky, which is that he consumes all of the energy, all of the attention, and all of the focus when he's involved. If he is the Republican nominee for president, I stand by my position that he will be a distraction from other candidates that are running for the Senate, for the House, and for local offices. It'll be very difficult for Republicans, I think, to regain control of the United States Senate. I think it'll be difficult for them to hold the House of Representatives. Nationally and in Minnesota, I think it will create drama and turmoil. But that's what Donald Trump does everywhere he goes.
I do want to just say one more thing about the timing aspect that you mentioned. Steve Simon had mentioned, early voting for the presidential primary does start mid-January. I had recently looked it up because the chairs of both of the major parties are the ones that are required to put forth the names that will appear on that presidential ballot. That is due to the Secretary of State's office January 2nd. So with this November 2nd hearing, there's really only 2 months between that and when the Secretary of State's office is requiring those names to be to them, because obviously with primary voting starting on January 19th, that's only 2 weeks for them to print the tens or hundreds of thousands of ballots or million, I don't know how, of ballots to get them mailed out to folks who have required absentee voting by mail. And so I say this, I think every episode we have to wait and see, but it is an extreme time crunch. And so I don't think this is going to be the last time we talk about this over the coming months. And hopefully whether it's Dave or James or other individuals, we have some more insight to bring to the conversation.
But you also looked it up because you're a nerd.
Well, yeah.
Okay, just wanted to be clear about that. That's the main reason you looked it up, is because you're a nerd.
Yeah, that's what I do in my spare time.
It was really, really interesting to see with Secretary Simon in the room who was the biggest election nerd, because you were really geeked out, and it was fun to see. It was a real battle between the nerds. We're going to transition now to a subject that I'm just so excited to talk about. We're going to talk about our Pick'em League.
Yeah.
Becky, why don't you start it off this week? Because I think you got a little bit of swagger. I think you got a little bit of cockiness in you. Why don't you start off?
Cockiness or confidence?
I would say cockiness. I don't know how.
I think it is a valid point. So this week, week 3, I am in the lead for most correct picks at the point of this episode. Now, I think there are still 2 games, 1 game left to come through. But at this point, I am leading you by 2 points. If we're just doing the internal battle between me and you, I have 2 more games that I chose. I got 10 right so far, and you have 8.
But just to be clear, you're still behind. You're still trailing.
It's going to take some incremental little wins here, okay?
But can we just be clear you're still trailing?
Well, let's talk about we got to look on the horizon.
Are you losing right now to me? That's
I am.
what listeners want to know. Our listeners are showing up to these episodes because they want to know if Michael is beating Becky. And right now, Becky, who is winning?
Well, you are, but aren't you getting a little scared? If I get two steps closer this week?
No, I'm not scared or concerned about the person who didn't make the right picks the first week.
It wasn't my fault.
Who's milking that?
It was the setup.
It wasn't a setup.
It was.
It wasn't a setup. No, I feel very comfortable where I am. I'm in a guillotine league that I'm still in. I haven't made it this far in previous years. I'm still in the guillotine league. I have a fantasy football league with my family that I'm crushing right now. I'm beating my sister Julie. I don't know if I'll win today, but I'm currently beating her. I beat my sister Susan earlier this year. I beat my sister Kathleen's husband. I'm just crushing it right now in fantasy football. You picking up a couple games one week after you screwed up the first week, I'm not going to break any sweat over.
It's a really long season, and if I win, if I pick up 1 or 2 games a week as we go, that's going to flip real quick.
But just based on past experience, there's still a clear opportunity for you to have some technical issue where you don't
Nope,
pick anyone.
not gonna.
That's what I'm banking on. I'm
Not gonna
banking on a
happen.
technical screw up once again, that you don't make any picks for one league and the whole season's gone.
So the commissioner is coming out and saying that he's gonna. I don't know. I feel like that seems a little sketchy.
Look, you can next season, if we're still doing this, you can be the commissioner.
Perfect.
Okay.
Done.
I've been a commissioner of multiple leagues, and no one has ever once, not to say that the allegation hasn't been made, but none of my family members have been able to prove anything whatsoever today that I've engaged in any malfeasance for the sake of malfeasance or any tomfoolery or monkey shines.
All
I've
right.
done none of that stuff. Okay.
On
But
the-
it's a common theme.
On the football front, though, I have to say, so you were at the Vikings game this weekend.
Oof.
Tell me a little bit about that.
It was tough. I went with my son. It was a tough game. I have to say a couple things. Family's had season tickets since 1961. We've had season tickets every year that the Vikings have been around. I have been to a lot of Vikings games. Yesterday's crowd on Sunday was just ugly. There was a thickness in the air. They were chippy. They were optimistic at first, I would say that, and that quickly changed. There was just an ugly demeanor to the crowd. And rightfully, this team is 0-3. There was a lot of sloppy play yesterday. It was a tough game to watch. And there's something going on this season with the Vikings that didn't happen last year, which is every time there's an opportunity for them to win, in essence, a close play. Last year they won them. This year they're losing. But it's a tough situation to be. It's tough to be 0-3 in the NFL and make the playoffs and do well. Sure, it's happened once or twice before, but statistically, this is not looking good for the Vikings. They got a tough couple games coming in, but it was an ugly crowd yesterday, ugly game. But it's important that I introduce and have introduced over the years the emotional drama and pain and trauma of being a Vikings fan to my children. They're experiencing it. Yesterday, my son experienced it. My daughters will likely experience it again later this season when I take them to some games. But I'm a proud Vikings fan. I'm passionate about the team. I got home yesterday. I put on my optimistic since 1961 sweatshirt, and I'm ready for next week. But it's going to be a tough season, I think.
And I will close with one last comparison of your confidence with the Vikings to your confidence in this league and hoping that it carries over. On Saturday, you did tweet, "Don't be down about the Gophers game. The Vikings play tomorrow. By 3 p.m. tomorrow, we'll all be smiling again. Trust me." #Skol with a gif of Franco winking. Now that's pretty. We're talking cocky here.
That was
That's
cocky.
that. And now you were wrong with your cocky confidence then. So I'm just going to say, I think you're going to be wrong in our league too, but time will tell.
We'll see. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you. Have a good one. We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show us some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. Again, our website is bbreakpod.com, and then you can find us at Twitter at bbreakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be returned next week. Have a great one.
See ya.